Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is the second part of the Democratic Revolution um, recorded lecture. And so, in the first part, we talked about kind of why it's historians call it the Democratic Revolution, is because what you're having throughout the early 1800s until eventually the 1832 presidential election is states granting non-property owning, even non-tax paying adult men who are citizens the right to vote. And so nowhere else in the world did you have that kind of, first of all, voting, but especially allowing non-property owning adult, white men to vote and so forth. Now, granted, there's some groups that are still left out of that. We're going to cover that throughout U.S. History 1 and 2. Women, African Americans, Native Americans, 18 to 20-year-olds, all four of those groups will eventually get the right to vote at some point in American history. So, but the second part, I'm going to focus on really Andrew Jackson's presidency, and it's really centered around three key kind of events and so forth. And really, that's going to be his war on the National Bank. Even though it doesn't officially end during his presidency, he is basically going to kill it by 1840, by the time Martin Van Buren leaves the White House. Secondly, the Indian Removal Act, which he is probably most remembered for, is removing the Indians out of the American Southeast and some of the Midwest into Oklahoma and Kansas. And then thirdly, the nullification crisis, where South Carolina threatened to secede for the first time and so forth in the 1830s. So, and we're going to look at this because really in American history, few presidents have had as much impact while being president as Andrew Jackson has. Now, there's others who have one-upped him in history, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, LBJ, and so forth. But really, Jackson was really the first president who kind of one-upped Congress, so to speak, and wielded in a lot of ways more power than Congress. Now, he did use the presidential veto 6 times, and that was revolutionary, more than all the previous presidents combined. Granted, there wasn't very many presidents before him. Of course, Andrew Johnson, who serves after Lincoln's going to put him to shame. So really what Jackson did is he kind of used his popular mandate to transform the presidency and the policies of the national government. During his 2 terms in office, he enhanced the authority of the president over that of Congress. He destroyed the nationalistic American system and ordained a new ideology for the democracy. So let's look at Andrew Jackson as president. So he appointed Francis Preston Blair, who was editor of the Washington Globe, who was basically the Democratic Party's newspaper. Remember, I told you that in the first part, the Martin Van Buren, they established their own Democratic newspaper. Amos Kendall was a speechwriter. Roger B. Taney was the Attorney General and later becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and probably the most racist Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in American history. Martin Van Buren, Secretary of State, as some of his most influential cabinet members. Now, Martin Van Buren is eventually going to become president after Jackson serves 2 terms. So generally, the Secretary of State had been the kind of stepping stones to the White House. Now, the reason why these men are kind of considered his kitchen cabinet is because of the Peggy Eaton affair. So if you remember in part 1 of this Democratic Revolution lecture, I mentioned about how Andrew Jackson loved his wife Rachel dearly. And because insults were hurled at her when he ran for president a second time in 1828 and won, his wife died in between his election and inauguration, and he never really forgave his opponents for the things they said, calling them an adulterer and yada yada, because her first marriage didn't end in divorce before her and Andrew Jackson were married, and so forth. So a similar situation. One of his cabinet members, John Eaton, who was the Secretary of War, which is basically the 1820s version of Secretary of Defense. Peggy Eaton had a similar situation that Rachel Jackson had, and some of the other cabinet members' wives kind of scorned her and looked down upon her, such as John Calhoun's wife, and made a lot of gossip. And Andrew Jackson, fresh off of the loss of his wife, he hears about it and he is livid. And at a cabinet meeting dinner with all the husbands and wives, he calls them out in front of everybody. Now, at that time, socially, it sounds like a kind of a reality TV scenario. It may not be as uncommon now, but back then that was like unheard of. Now, and so members of his cabinet resigned in offense. Okay, and John Calhoun was originally a supporter, ends up becoming a opponent of Jackson as a result of this. And what happens is Andrew Jackson appoints what they called his kitchen cabinet, a bunch of his good old boys from Tennessee and supporters. I mean, Martin Van Buren wasn't, but and so they said he let him in the back door of the kitchen of the White House. So this is the political cartoon. It's kind of funny. Jackson sitting there in the kitchen cabinet running in, which I love the little rats with his cabinet members' faces on it, which I think is pretty clever for whoever the artist was that drew that at the time. So anyway, so John Calhoun goes back to South Carolina and he runs for the Senate and wins. And he is going to be a turd in Jackson's life, so to speak, because of the nullification crisis. So here's his members of his kitchen cabinet. Roger B. Taney was the one who was ended up being definitely one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial, Supreme Court judge in American history with the Dred Scott decision that we'll cover in the 1850s. So one of the things that Martin Van Buren helped establish outside the White House and then Jackson established in the White House is what's called the spoils system. Now, Jackson starts it in the presidency, but don't feel like that every president between him and the 1870s is innocent of it, because they all did it, including Lincoln. But they use a spoils system. So where basically if you supported them or helped vote for some of their bills or something in Congress after you left the office, they would get you a government position. And so like that happened. You see that portrayed in the movie Lincoln to get the 13th Amendment passed. That's the spoils system. Now, Jackson, his agenda is he really wants to destroy the American system. So he's going to demolish the bank. He's going to veto any kind of internal infrastructure improvements such as roads and canals. He also didn't he actually voted for the tariff of 1828, but he's going to help push for a compromise tariff. And really, Henry Clay is the one that does it, but Andrew Jackson gets credit for it. So, but go figure. So let's look at the tariff and nullification issues. So we're going to cover three big issues in Jackson's presidency. We'll cover the nullification crisis first. So basically what happened is the tariff of 1828, which the South called the Tariff Abomination, was costing them about an additional $100 million across the entire South, okay, not just one state, each year. And so, which that was a lot of money back then, because the tariff made British goods more expensive, particularly, and other countries' goods, and because they were designed to protect American industry. And because British workers made lower wages, their goods were cheaper. And so the Southerners don't care so much about helping out American businesses in the North, which is pretty selfish. They wanted the cheapest price good they could get, no matter what. So Jackson, he voted for it in 1828, but he's just kind of minding his own business as president at this point. And so what happens is John Calhoun and the other South Carolina senator argue that, hey, if we as a state find something ridiculous, we have the right to nullify it. And nullify means just to ignore, not abide by it. Well, Daniel Webster, who was a famous Whig politician, said, look, no matter what, we need union together. So he's like basically union at all costs. Jackson's basically like, all right, our federal union's got to be preserved. Calhoun was like, yeah, the union next to our liberty is most dear. And so Calhoun and other South Carolina influential politicians said, hey, we're not going to abide by this. And Jackson was like, oh, yes, you are. And if you don't, I'm going to send the United States Army down there. I'm going to hang you for treason. Now, knowing what Jackson had done to the Seminole Chiefs in Florida in the 1810s, that's not out of the question. So you got to remember, his wife has passed away. He is a little bit, a stubborn man, to say the least. So now he does, one thing you do got to admire about him, he does enact and preserve federal law. So that is the job of a president, is to enact and make sure that federal law is enforced. That's actually straight from the Constitution. So Jackson does do that. And of course, he's a little rough around the edges in how he handles it. Calhoun is really out of line because it's a federal law that supersedes state law. And Daniel Webster is just trying to bring everybody together like a school recess teacher. So what ends up happening is Henry Clay, he had come up with the Missouri Compromise. Now he's going to come up with this compromise, and later comes up with most of the compromise of 1850. And this is where he gets the nickname the Great Compromiser. He in 1832 came up with a new compromise tariff that was going to gradually reduce the tariff 25% over 10 years. And so it appeases the North, so they're still getting the tariff benefit, but also appeases the South because it's going to lower it. He thinks it's going to propel him to the White House. Not so fast, because Andrew Jackson is one of the most popular presidents while he's in office. So Jackson responds with, this threat of enforcing federal law, and then Clay's compromise tariff. Hope's going to propel him in the White House. In fact, he loses in 1832 as a Whig candidate. So anyway, the nullification crisis averts secession, averts controversy, averts Jackson having to hang South Carolina politicians for treason because of Clay and his compromise bill. But Jackson gets credit for it in the public's eye. And so you have a lot of kind of voters that weren't really aware of what was actually going on in Washington. Henry Clay was the guy who actually got it passed. So anyway, Calhoun and Jackson kind of are enemies from that point on. Now, one of the things that Calhoun did write, it's kind of this famous work. It's called South Carolina Exposition and Protest, basically saying that we have the right to nullify law. And Jackson's like, no, you don't. And the whole Civil War proved that, no, you don't. So basically, the Civil War showed that federal law supersedes states' law and state rights. All right. So they're in this whole process of this bill. Robert Hayne is the other senator from South Carolina. They have this famous debate in Congress that, got all these applause from both sides or whatever, and is considered these great orators of their era. Daniel Webster was probably the greatest speaker of his era. And Webster argued that we should have our Union preserved now and forever and so forth. So at this point, Southerners feel like they're becoming a permanent minority and kind of had a chip on their shoulder. And this has been 1833. You fast forward almost 30 years, and South Carolina is the very state that first secedes from the Union when Lincoln's elected. So it's interesting. This is kind of what's showing of things to come, so to speak. All right, now we're going to talk about the second issue for Jackson's presidency, and that's renewing the charter of the National Bank. So if you remember, back in Module 2, Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, great Secretary of the Treasury, convinced Washington and Federalists that we needed a national bank. And the national bank worked. I mean, it worked so much that even Jefferson didn't get rid of it, even though he hated it. And then they renewed it in 1860 under James Monroe's presidency. So it was supposed to be renewed every 20 years. So it was in place from 1816 until basically 1836. But Clay, to try to score political points and hope propel him to the White House in the election of 1832, made a decision it's going to backfire and bite him in the rear end. So what he did is he advocated that they should move the renewal for the charter of the bank up.
Hi, John.
My apologies, guys, as Siri was picking up something I was saying. So what ends up happening is the charter was supposed to be renewed in 1836. He pushes it to be renewed in 1832. And so it does get passed because it was working. And the reason why he did this, he knows that Jackson's going to veto it. And by Jackson veto it, he thought it would score him political points and get Jackson not reelected. It backfires. People praise him, particularly a lot of the Westerners. A lot of the poor people thought, Jackson's looking out for us, yeah. And so they're all excited about it. And it actually propels Jackson back into the White House. So what Jackson does to eliminate the bank, okay, so just vetoing its charter renewal doesn't end the bank, because it was still operating whether it has, the U.S. Treasury funds in it or not, because it was a safe deposit for our currency, but there was a lot of private investor deposits in there as well. The head of the bank is a guy named Nicholas Biddle. And so Jackson demanded that Nicholas Biddle take the U.S. currency out of the bank and put it in other state banks, because it's got to go in some kind of bank at that time. And he called them his pet banks. Now, let me explain why Jackson, as a Westerner from Tennessee, was distrustful of banks. The panic of 1819 during James Monroe's presidency, which has nothing to do with James Monroe, but really the main cause of it was banks were lending money to people who couldn't afford it, and then there was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that protects their money in the bank by the U.S. Treasury. And so a lot of Westerners lost their life savings in these banks as they went under in the Panic of 1819. So Jackson, who lost quite a bit of money in that panic, didn't like banks either, particularly the National Bank. He distrusted them. He thought that they were, going to exploit the people and so forth. So a lot of these Westerners, when he does this to the bank, they applaud him because they're like, dude, he's the man. He's looking out for my interests. He represents me. And so he was so, popular. But then people that knew what was going on with banking, who disagree with them, maybe in the Northeast or other states like New York, were like, what the heck? And they're ticked about this. Biddle refused to do it, and Jackson ended up firing him and put somebody in there who actually would move the money into these state or pet banks and so forth. And this is one of my favorite political cartoons, really the first half of American history. You've got Jackson here with the white fro boxing Nicholas Biddle. He's the guy, this guy's back to the image. And each of these spectators are saying something. Martin Van Buren's in the back. And what's interesting is this frontiersman with like a cat hat on his head, and he's got a big thing of liquor right beside him. It's basically making fun of the frontiersmen who support him and so forth. And so he thought the bank was corrupt and so forth. Now, the veto doesn't end the bank, but taking the money out of the Bank of the United States actually contributes to the Panic of 1837. So we've rarely had a president who has had that much decision-making that actually led to a whole national panic, and actually screws over Martin Van Buren. He loses re-election in 1840 when really had nothing to do with him and had everything to do with Jackson. And the bank is dead by 1840. This is when critics called him King Andrew, like he's standing on the torn apart Constitution, and he's got a veto slip of paper in his hand, and he's got a king's sepulcher and crown on his head. So they called him, the Whigs called him King Andrew. And what's crazy is really what held the Whig party together in the 1830s and 1840s, particularly in the 1830s, was they hated Andrew Jackson. You had a political party formed specifically against Old Hickory, the man, the myth, the legend, Andrew Jackson. Now, as a side note, I got to tell you an interesting story. At one point, long before he was in the White House, he had got into a dispute over his honor with a guy who was a sharpshooter, and they decided in Tennessee they were going to duel, which was legal at the time, and they decided they were going to duel across a river from each other. Now, typically when people duel, they would march their so many paces between them, and then they would turn around with one loaded pistol, and they would kind of fire a courtesy shot in the air to show they were man enough to stand in front of somebody with a gun. Well, some of these frontiersmen kind of duels, like they actually shot him. And so Alexander Hamilton gets shot and killed by Aaron Burr. Jackson actually got wounded he dueled Thomas Hart Benton, a famous senator from Missouri, and had a bullet stuck in his shoulder the rest of his life. And they called him Old Rattles because they said bullets rattled against his bones when he was moving around. He had trouble getting around from time to time. He was a tough old dude. At one point, though, when he was dueling this sharpshooter, he thought to himself, if only way I can get this guy is if I take careful aim. So when they dueled, they turned around at the river and faced each other. The sharpshooter took a shot, hit Jackson in the shoulder. Jackson took careful aim, shot and hit him in the head. And a famous Jackson quote he said afterwards was, I don't care if the SOB would have shot me in the head, I don't care if he would have shot me in the head, I still would have killed the SOB. So that tells you what kind of guy Andrew Jackson was. Pretty rough around the edges. And so this is Jackson holding the refusal to government deposits and all these evil people of Congress and the bankers. Well, we get somebody with the devil's horn running away. And so this is in favor of Jackson doing this. And here Jackson is seen as like a hero for the bank war. What you have is soft money, it's paper money. State bankers felt that it kind of restrained, the National Bank kind of restrained them from issuing paper money to have new currency. The one reason why the National Bank didn't want to do it is because it could lead to inflation, hence what we have today. Hard specie is what's gold and silver. And a lot of Westerners had trouble getting that hard currency. That's why they wanted paper money. And anyway, so Jackson destroys the bank. It is done by 1840. Sorry, 1841, not 1840. And it's bankrupt, and that's why we don't see the National Bank today. So don't think Bank of America is the National Bank today. This is Andrew Jackson. This is a pro Andrew Jackson political cartoon. This is him fighting with his veto all these evil-headed snake bankers and so forth in the country. All right. So with putting money in the state banks have a little more ability to issue paper money. One of the things, though, that they wanted is that you buy future federal land only with gold or silver. Jackson's goal was to make it easier to purchase land with paper money. The problem is banknotes lose their value, land sales plummeted, and credit's not available, and it causes the Panic of 1837. So Jackson, single president, actually his business decision and political decision to destroy the bank leads to the Panic of 1837. By removing the U.S. Treasury money out of the national bank and putting it in state banks, which issued a lot more paper money, that it led to an economic downturn for the economy. So it was the Depression of 1837. Now, the last issue, which Jackson is most known for, is the Indian Removal Act. Now, Jackson gets a lot of blame for this. He deserves 100% blame for the national bank issue. And that was just really kind of the people giving credit to him when Henry Clay should have got it for the nullification crisis. But the Indian Removal Act, he gets a lot of blame for it. Really, at this time, there's a lot of people who should get blamed for it. One, Congress passes it. Okay, so you had to have a majority of congressional members to vote for it. Jackson signs the law. Okay, that he's definitely at fault for this. John Quincy Adams would have prevented this from happening. But really, you got to look at American farmers. Not all the American farmers wanted this, but the ones who wanted to move into Native American land. You had farmers who wanted to move into Georgia on Cherokee land for cotton. You had settlers who wanted to move in Alabama on Creek land for cotton cultivation. You had others who wanted to move in Choctaw and Chickasaw land in Mississippi for cotton cultivation. You had others that wanted to move into parts of Florida where the Seminoles were. You had those that were wanting to move into the tribes that were west of the Great Lakes or Minnesota. They wanted that farmland. And so unfortunately for them, they are booted out. Now, let me kind of explain Jackson's really his mindset, because Jackson had been an Indian fighter. He had fought in the Creek War right before what was going on during the War of 1812 because they supported the British. Jackson was able to defeat the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. It was called Weatherford's War because the Creek leader was actually half white, half Creek, named Weatherford, and Jackson defeated him. And in fact, the next day, surprisingly, Weatherford came into the Tennessee Volunteers camp, which is where the University of Tennessee gets its mascot from, and offered to surrender. And Jackson was so amazed at his courage, he let him go and said, "You are free to go." Jackson, the people he hated the most were two groups. One, the British, because he blamed them for all the loss of his mom and his brother during the American Revolution. Plus, he refused to shine the boots of a British officer, and he took out a sword and sliced him. He had a permanent scar on his hand and head from it. So he hated the British more than anybody else. Well, maybe other than those that criticized his wife, Rachel. But the second group they hated the most was Native Americans, because they fought on the side of the British during the American Revolution. Never really got over that. He really had a lot of bitterness about the American Revolution because all of his loved ones died. It just kind of made him a hard man. Now, but even though he disliked the Native Americans, he respected them. And so in his mind, the best way to preserve them, because he knew that if they weren't removed, there was going to be further conflict. Settlers would move on their land, particularly when gold is discovered on Cherokee land, that they're basically it's going to be an issue that it's going to lead to further conflict. So he thought the best way to save them is to remove them to Oklahoma, where they're in Kansas, where their land is not desired there. Of course, the old saying about Oklahoma is that the Europeans took it from the Native Americans, and they went out there and they gave it back. I'm just kidding, Oklahoma, if you're from there. But anyway, but it's this Indian Removal Act gets passed in 1830 by Congress, and some of the tribes moved before 1835, but actually the Cherokee and the what we call the Trail of Tears actually doesn't happen until Martin Van Buren's presidency. He's the one that ends up pushing them into Oklahoma. So let's look at what ends up happening with two Supreme Court cases that are very important. Okay, so they're Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Wooster versus Georgia. And so what you end up having is in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall and the majority of the court denied Cherokee's claim of independence, declaring that Indian peoples were domestic dependent nations. Now, what happens is the state of Georgia tries to enact state law onto Cherokee land. The Cherokee, reason why they're called one of the civilized tribes, they actually had some Cherokee that got law degrees, not a degree, but had law training. And they sued and they tried in the court of law. In fact, the Cherokees actually had farmland and owned slaves even. And so the Supreme Court ruled that no, you're not an independent nation, but what you are is a domestic dependent nation. It means you're within our borders, you're your own nation, but you're dependent on the federal government. So it's basically like the federal government is who you answer to, not the state of Georgia. All right, so that basically John Marshall and the Supreme Court nullified Georgia law in Cherokee land. Then you have a guy named Samuel Wooster that gets involved. He was actually a Christian missionary to the Cherokee tribe, and the Cherokee really liked him. They welcomed him into their tribal lands. The state of Georgia had passed a law where white people could not go onto Cherokee land to try to prevent conflict. So when it finds out that this Christian missionary is there, the state of Georgia is looking for opportunity maybe to take away some of the Cherokee rights, and there ends up being an issue, and there ends up going to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court ruled that no, the Cherokee Nation can determine who's on their tribe. If they want Samuel Wooster there as a Christian missionary, they have the right to do so. And so John Marshall basically upheld Cherokee's rights as well, and in a lot of ways ruled that the Indian Removal Act couldn't happen. Well, Jackson makes a famous quote. He says, "John Marshall has made his ruling. Now let him enforce it." And basically saying he can say that all day long, but he has no power. I'm the commander in chief. I command the military. If I want to remove them, I can remove them. And that's really where Jackson is kind of blamed a lot in American history for the Indian Removal Act. You can read a little more about the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Every year when I taught AP US history, I'd always tell kids, guarantee one of these Supreme Court cases are going to be on the AP exam. So if you look right here, here is where the tribes move from. So the Cherokee are primarily in northern Georgia. They're a little bit in Tennessee. Some of them in the Smoky Mountains. That was originally where some of them had settled in the Smoky Mountains. A little bit into Alabama. The Creeks had been in Georgia, but got kicked out by the state of Georgia. They were primarily in Alabama. The Choctaws and Chickasaws were in the top half of Mississippi, and the Seminole were down there in central Florida. So they get moved to Oklahoma. Now, what often is forgotten is what about the tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and northern Indiana and northern Illinois. So, for instance, Chicago never would have taken off had these tribes not been removed to Kansas. So the Sauk and Fox tribe actually resist. It's called Black Hawk's War. And in fact, future President Abraham Lincoln and future President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, actually fought in that. You have the Ottawa tribe, the Potawatomis and the Miamis, and the Shawnee and Seneca, which had very little land in Ohio, all got moved to Kansas. So that's the other part of the Indian Removal Act everybody forgets. Everybody remembers the 5 civilized tribes. They remember the Trail of Tears, but they forget about the tribes of the Midwest that got removed as well. And so what's sad is on the Trail of Tears, not only are they forced to remove in winter, and you have a lot of people that are sick and ailing and so forth. There were some that held out and hid in the Smoky Mountains or the Appalachian Mountains and caves and so forth and refused to leave. Some of them are able to get some of their land back years later in American history, or their descendants. But the Cherokee, a lot of them get sick. About 25% of them die on the way. What's sad is they get into Missouri, they split their group. One went to the southern half of Missouri. The one that went to the northern half of Arkansas actually get attacked by the Osage Indians, and some of them are killed. That's terrible on top of that. And later the Osage Indians are removed. So the Trail of Tears is one of the more kind of shameful moments in American history, if you will. I wouldn't say Americans there waking up like, yeah, I'm proud of the Trail of Tears and the Interremoval Act, baby, yeah. And so you just don't see that. It's the treatment of Native Americans is really one of the dark spots in American history. And so the Treaty of New Anchota, some of the chiefs signed it illegally, but it didn't have the approval of all the chiefs, and that's where it kind of was their sovereignty and so forth was violated with the Indian Removal Act. And here is where the Cherokee Nation primarily lived. There were some that were in North Carolina, a little bit up in the mountains. So gorgeous part of our country right there. In fact, the movie Gone with the Wind was supposed to be at a plantation where Cherokee land actually was in northern Georgia. Here's a famous painting of the Indian Removal Act. You can see some of the soldiers in their winter clothing, forced march. And what you end up seeing happening, once that cotton cultivation land is opened up, look at it by 1830 and look at it by 1860. The Indian Removal Act was a stepping stone to that actually taking place. So, one of the sadder moments in American history for sure. This is from a lieutenant, if you want to read a firsthand account of what the Trail of Tears was like. Now, not everybody is willing to give up. The Seminoles fought until Vietnam. It was the longest war in American history, and they actually fought a successful guerrilla war, and eventually they get to keep their lands. So, way to go, Seminole tribe. You got to admire that. The fact that they were removed forcefully and didn't want to be, and they were able to fight a guerrilla war, particularly in the Everglades, and they were able to retain their lands in Florida. It lasted for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years. And what's interesting, you see a lot of Native American names and so forth trying to get removed from as mascots, like Arkansas State University used to be the Indians, now they're the Red Wolves. But you never hear any controversy about Florida State being the Seminoles. And I read an article about this. The Seminole tribe loves it because it provides them more notoriety than they ever had, because Florida State's football team has been typically good over the years. And plus they're Florida, and Tallahassee, where they are, is the capital of Florida. So they liked that recognition and so forth. Now, last thing for Jackson's presidency, let's look at Jackson's accomplishments, and then we'll end part 2, and then we'll get to part 3 in another lecture. He does enlarge the power of the presidency more than any president before him. Now, there's going to be other presidents who are going to enlarge even more so. But he considered himself a direct representative of the people, and a lot of Americans loved him at that time. He didn't feel like he should abide by Congress. He should abide by the American people. So the American people want the Indian Removal Act. I'm going to pass the law. American people don't like the bank. I'm going to veto it, and so forth. And used the veto more than any other president before him. And you can read over that, some of the things we just talked about. Now, because of Jackson, you have a new political party formed because they hate him, the Whigs, and then you have a new political party, the Democrats, which are still around today. So, and then the Whigs eventually disintegrate in the 1850s, and the Republicans kind of rise up out of convergence of about 3 political parties. So, failures of Jackson's legacy was we had greater social stratification during his presidency, and after, gap between the rich and the poor visibly widened. And then the Industrial Revolution, you'll see that even more of a middle class emerge in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. And his decision about the bank leads to the Panic of 1837. But let's look at this. This is Andrew Jackson 1 year before he died. He was able to see his protege, James K. Polk, become president. Looks like a sad man, but he did have great hair. You got to give him that. So here's top 10 accomplishments of Andrew Jackson. First president from state west of the Appalachian Mountains, and he won't be the last. First Tennessean to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was also the first territorial governor of Florida. He also was the first person to ever serve as a House of Representative, senator, and president. What a boss. He also exercised veto 12 times. I'm sorry, I said 6 originally. It's next to 12. And then represented the majority of the people in his mind, founded the Democratic Party. Only president to ever be censored by the U.S. Senate, which I thought was hilarious. And then the second one, he was the first president to ever have an assassination attempt. Now, this one shows you how kind of guy Jackson was. A guy walked up to him with two pistols. They both misfired. He took out his cane and just started beating the man on the steps of the Capitol building, and had to be pulled off of him because he almost killed him with his cane. So, point of the story is don't mess with old Hickory. And then also he got us out of debt. So that's an accomplishment right there.